Maureen, Andrade, and Kelly Hall, welcome to the Women in Business Impact Lab podcast.
Good morning.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
We're excited.
It is a pleasure. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm also joined by my co-host, Angela Schill. We're all professors at Utah Valley University, and we're all associated with the Women in Business Impact Lab. Today, we're going to be talking about a recent research brief that we put out titled Pandemic-Related Job Changes and Preferences by Gender. I'm super excited to pick your brains and learn a little bit more about this research brief and really the data more generally as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to briefly introduce everyone and then give them the opportunity to share a little bit more about themselves. Dr. Maureen Andrade is a professor of organizational behavior and leadership at Utah Valley University and assistant director of the Women in Business Impact Lab. Dr. Kelly Hall is the director of the Women in Business Impact Lab and professor of leadership in the Woodbury School of Business. And Angela Schill is a professor in the organizational leadership department and teaches organizational behavior and such, and is also a faculty member and fellow in the Women in Business Impact Lab. Pleasure to have all of you. Starting with Maureen, do you want to share anything else about yourself with the audience?
Just very happy to be here and share some ideas about women in the workforce and how the pandemic impacted their experiences. So this is one of my research areas, and we've worked on a number of studies and papers on this topic. So happy to share what we know and hope that it will have some impact.
Wonderful. And Kelly.
Yeah, thank you again for having us on this morning. I guess I'll just add that I've been in higher education for a little over a decade. Prior to that, I was in industry. So I think it's super interesting to think about these challenges, having had that perspective of, living some of these things out in the context of organizations, and now having a little bit deeper understanding from the academic side and being able to kind of apply, the science to, what I was seeing in organizations for so many years.
Wonderful. And with that, let's go ahead and dive on in. I'll hand the baton over to Angela to get us rolling.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask, I'll shoot it out to both Kelly and Maureen. We're so excited to hear your perspective on this, but can you give us an overview of the Women in Business Impact Lab and the data that was collected?
Sure. So I guess I can start with an overview of the Impact Lab. Really, some of the things that we're focused on is conducting and disseminating research about gender in the workplace, really educating community members, diverse groups in terms of thinking about community very broadly, and engaging students and industry partners. So we have a research program underway. We also have a lot of industry facing activities to cover the education side, and of course, having the students at it. Maureen, do you want to add a little bit in terms of some of the things that we're focused on or this survey?
I can talk a little bit about this survey. So it was a fairly extensive survey asking about experiences in the workplace, work in general, work satisfaction, what are the most important characteristics in a job to help us get insights into women's experiences in the workplace. So we based this on some previous research that was done as well. So they're talking about their jobs and the characteristics of their job, how their work is meaningful, and other scheduling issues and the impact of COVID as well.
Thank you. In looking at that in terms of how the pandemic impacted the workplace, and what were the findings in all of the data that you collected in terms of the differences between how the pandemic changes impacted women versus impacted men?
So, as I'm sure you can imagine, I mean, just if you think about your own experiences and people that you know, the pandemic definitely impacted people in different ways. In our data set, we had both part-time workers and full-time workers. We had people across various industries. And so there's, certainly, some differences when we start looking at those things. But when we think about, reduction in hours, because, people needed to focus more on family. We saw in some cases men having to take on more hours. So certainly you can imagine, in a dual income household, if one person is transitioning their focus to more of a family focused role in caring for children and homeschool settings, that, the spouse would then have to potentially pick up some extra hours. So we did see a little bit of that in it. What was interesting and certainly something we can all relate to is new ways of working. That was one of the biggest changes that we saw for both men and women. The adoption of new ways of working.
Yeah, and I can just add a little bit about research generally on this topic. Basically, the impact on women has been seen to be much greater than the impact on men. So increased workloads, burnout, and stress because women were working from home, caring for their families, helping educate their children. So the large majority of women reported negative changes in their daily routines, and they felt like that was slowing their career progression. And something that's fairly alarming, and once again, this isn't specific to our study, but the research that surrounds the study is representation of women in the workforce has really declined as a result of the pandemic. And it's been a substantial setback. So there's not parity of representation in genders in the workforce.
Something that I was reading
ahead.
about that, sorry, John, something I was reading about that is talking about not just the change of women not being represented in the workplace, but also when it comes to promotion. If you're having to work from home and balancing education and taking care of children while men are in the workplace, seen more and have more opportunities to grow. And that's something that I think I read, that the men had more opportunities to be promoted during the pandemic, but women, less promotions, they weren't seen. And because of the way culturally things were set up, traditionally, that was a pain point.
I think it becomes really important to think about, implications, and the importance of having some flexibility in terms of work design. And that's certainly something, going back to some of the specific things we saw in our data, for both men and women, an increased preference for more flexible work options, increase in their preference for, having hybrid work or remote work relative to in-person work. And again, we saw that across both genders. And going back to your point, Angela, when flexibility options aren't being provided, and as a result of that, employees may choose, to leave their position or to, leave the workforce overall, even if for temporary, purposes, a year, 2 years, 3 years. That can have a really big effect overall in terms of opportunities for career advancement and earning power. Even when we look across, different industry sectors, women in particular, if they take 3 or more years off, then that slashes their earning potential by 37%. Wow. So it becomes really important for organizations to think about, what are some ways that we can provide, flexibility, and where are some opportunities for us to reevaluate how we're thinking about flexible work design.
It's also important to be aware of the culture around the flexibility that may or not be offered. So this is partially back to Angela's point, but if your organization does provide a range of flexible work options and work design, but men tend to not opt into that flexibility, so they're there in person, are there biases towards the FaceTime individuals who are there in person versus those, if women are disproportionately opting into the flexibility and they're not there, we already know that there's, biases that can negatively impact women's opportunities for leadership roles and advancement. That just gets exacerbated when now they're opting into flexible options and the men aren't as much. It's kind of like, with unlimited PTO. That's all the rage. People love talking about unlimited PTO, but how many people actually utilize their PTO? In fact, many studies say that show that people take less time off when they have unlimited PTO than they do when they just have a set amount of time. And often it's because, people feel like they get punished if they take the time off. And so you may, as an organization, as a leader, you may decide, yeah, we need to have flexible work design and flexible options. But what's the reality for people doing the jobs? Are they being disadvantaged in any way for taking advantage of those flexible options? And if they are, that's only going to set parity back and cause additional problems with the equity, whether it's pay equity or opportunities for, women's advancement in their career, leadership roles, etc.
Yeah, these are definitely significant issues. So sometimes there are hidden costs or masked issues related to the more flexible scheduling options, as John mentioned. And Angela has already referred to this, but women who work from home specifically do risk damaging their careers because they're not in the workplace. They're missing out on all the networking and informal relationship building that tends to advance a person's career. And one really interesting factor that came out during the pandemic was that men actually reported benefits from working at home more so than women, and said they were more productive, they got more pay increases and promotions, more responsibilities and leadership opportunities. So they saw it as a very positive thing, but it may be, that they were more productive because they're the women were taking care of family and educational responsibilities and were perhaps less productive. So there are still a lot of issues. Some managers also indicate that promotion opportunities are less accessible to remote workers than people who are physically present. So I think that's something we still have to get over, is if you're working from home, are you like forgotten about because you're not there talking to your manager every day or whatever.
And if you would indulge me for just a minute, I'll give a personal example of this. We all could, right? Because we all went through the pandemic and we all experienced this and what it was like to have all of our kids doing schooling from home and trying to juggle work and all of that. I'm a professor. My wife is also a university instructor. When the pandemic hit, we had 6 children all doing schooling at home from 2nd grade all the way up to junior year of high school, trying to balance our workloads with their workloads, literally just trying to figure out the technology. How do we, because we're a economically socioeconomically comfortable. We have devices and those sorts of things. We didn't have enough devices for 8 people at the same time to be doing stuff. And so we had to navigate that. We had to then help with the tech stuff. We had to help with the motivation, all of those sorts of things. I think, I would like to think, at least hopefully, that me and my wife split the load pretty evenly and that I didn't overly burden her. I feel like I did. You'd have to ask her, though, on her perspective on that. But I remember, especially early days during the pandemic, just kind of monitoring social media, lots of female friends who it was very, very clear that they were taking on the heavy load of the homeschooling responsibilities, all the normal kind of family stuff and disproportionate amount of stuff that women tend to do anyways with the cleaning and the housework and all those sorts of things. They were taking on that heavy load and trying to juggle their work. It was really, really hard. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that our survey data illustrated this fact that sometimes men actually found it really nice to be working from home, as long as they had a spouse who was willing to do all the other stuff that they weren't going to do, and they just got to benefit from the flexibility.
Yeah,
That just
excellent point.
that brought back memories of I was kind of reflecting on my experience during the pandemic as well. Just the home experience we had. I think 6 of us trying to just get the internet to have enough bandwidth for that to go forward. And I think I was trying to remember what that was like because that was me. That was me trying to help my 4 children go through school, the youngest in kindergarten, which was probably the hardest, to be quite honest, with that young one that had just a little amount of self-discipline, but he was expected to do work. And so it's kind of a dark time period. When I look back, I think I just blacked it out. But when I revisit that and think about how can we create a space, or what are some ideas about how to create that flexibility we're talking about, where remote work, the pandemic introduced this great opportunity for remote work, but how do we then build in the respect that it's not just that it's valuable, and then how do we recognize people when they are home and getting the ability to do something in a non-traditional way, have the flexibility, and still be able to be respected as a valuable contributing member of the company.
I think first, leaders need to dig into the assumptions that they're making. And this, we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, what are the assumptions that are being made about, how work needs to be done and when work needs to be done. Certainly assumptions around work taking place from 9 to 5, for most of us, that just doesn't line up with the realities that we live in. And also, not stigmatizing the people who are taking advantage of flexible options. And John, back to your point, we know that happens more for women than men. That's been borne out in the research. So being aware of that, and then working to change perceptions around that. Work should absolutely be judged in terms of, the talent and the work that's being done, not just, FaceTime in your office. Those are 2 very different things, and one doesn't equate to the other. Thinking about, what are the reasons why organizations are often hesitant to move in those flexible work design options. It's loss of control, fears about loss of collaboration, fears about loss of culture, loss of contribution. So really taking time to identify, what is it about, these new ways of working that are making us feel uneasy. And if you can identify what those are, now you can start being intentional about, okay, how can you design some processes and some practices to mitigate those concerns. So I do think it takes time to think about, get all of that out on the table, and then think creatively about, okay, how can we, move forward with these things that we know not only benefit women, it also benefits men in the workplace too. But, again, doing it in a very intentional way so that you can mitigate those risks that you're concerned about.
Right. And I think employers need to look at the whole person in terms of job satisfaction. So they need to look at, mentoring employees to help them gain more opportunities and experiences that will lead to promotions, physical, mental well-being on the job, and just making sure, your family's taken care of and things at home are running smoothly so that you can focus on all the different responsibilities you have and balance them. And so I think employers need to look at things with a fairly broad perspective in terms of how to support employees, help them grow, help them be beneficial to the company and to their own careers, so that they'll be satisfied with their work and they'll stay in the company and do great things. So there's a lot of opportunities, but sometimes I think our mindsets are maybe very traditional in how we perceive leadership and expectations in the workplace.
Yeah, and I'll just add an example for us here at the university. Like most universities, things shut down almost overnight, right? And for many organizations, that was the case. We happened to be going into a spring break when the pandemic hit. And so we literally just had that week off. Anyone who's teaching an in-person class had to move to online. And then we didn't come back. Students didn't come back. Faculty didn't come back. I'm a department chair at the university, so I have a slightly different role than the average faculty member. And I remember in those early days asking the question, the campus is empty, nobody's here. Am I expected to be on campus? And my dean said, absolutely, you're a department chair, you need to be here on campus. And I'm like, I have 6 children that are trying to do school at home. Why do I need to be on campus? I had to push back probably 5 or 6 times before finally he relented. Oh, and by the way, he was working from Hawaii. And so, he, at that point, he's like, okay, yeah, go ahead and do what you need to do. And it worked out. It all worked out. But it took some back and forth because of those assumptions that this particular individual had. And then, of course, over time, we kind of grew into that and we became more comfortable with that, even those who had that discomfort. But, as we broaden out beyond just the scope of this particular research brief or even our data, and we think about the Great Resignation, all the conversations that have happened around that, quiet quitting, all the conversations that have happened around that, what was the cause of so much of that? People taking time to reevaluate their priorities, taking time to think about what was most important to them, and was their organization respecting their boundaries? Were their leaders showing empathy towards them? And if they were, in most cases, people were fine with their jobs. But what we saw was many people realized, no, they're not respecting my boundaries. They're expecting more and more and more. I'm not seeing that empathy when I'm dealing with all this other stuff. And the labor market was tight and people realized they had options. And so we saw everything unfold that has unfolded over the last year and a half in regards to the labor market. And so it just illustrates the point here that as the nature of work is shifting and as worker expectations are shifting, that leaders need to be aware of. I mean, they don't need to like it. I don't care if you agree with it or not, but it's the reality. And the reality is that people expect more flexibility. And we need to provide flexibility without consequence. So we can't have the stigma attached to people who choose the flexibility option versus those who don't. Otherwise, we're going to set the gender equity stuff back. And some reports have suggested we've already set it back a generation. So we have a lot of work to do here.
And there's some relatively recent data that's come out from Future Forum as well, looking specifically at the relationship between providing flexibility and what does that mean for DEI initiatives. And I believe it was 60% of Black employees who indicated that they were unhappy with the flexibility in their workplaces, intended on looking for a new job in the coming year. And so I think for, especially places, like where we are, we want to increase, the diversity and have more perspectives and draw more people into, the technology hub that we have here. I think that that's an important point to consider as well. And then I also think it's important to think about, if an organization has decided they do need to bring employees back to the office, even if, not full blown like they were pre-pandemic, to think about how is that being communicated. Disney, was in the news recently because their employees are being called back to the office 4 days a week. But the date for that's March 1st. So, thinking about a 45 to 60 day timeline to give people time to readjust, that's important. But what's even more important than that is communicating to your employees, how, if we're going to ask that you come back to the office more often than, what we saw during the pandemic, here are some other things that we are going to be doing to still provide flexibility and the opportunity for you to have greater work-life integration. So again, really thinking about it very holistically, I think is important.
And Kelly, you need to be ready and willing to regularly communicate the why behind it. So if you're asking people to come back, there better be a good reason other than you just want people to come back. People aren't putting up with that.
Right. We have a colleague here at the university who wanted to continue working remotely after the pandemic, and her supervisor basically said no. So she evaluated, she is in a situation where she commuted to the university and spent, 2 or 3 hours a day in that commute. And she just said she didn't want to do it anymore. So she resigned. So people are making choices that could have a negative impact on an organization. And I went on an accreditation visit to another university last spring, and we got a lot of feedback from the staff at that university about inconsistencies in who could or could not work from home, and why couldn't they work from home, and what were the expectations. So, that in that situation, the university had not kind of reevaluated its current practices to decide what changes they could make in a positive direction. So I think it's still kind of up in the air all across the nation in terms of, if employers are demanding people come back more permanently in the traditional work in the office kind of arrangement, or if they are actually going to be more flexible long term. I think we're at a crossroads in that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I just a little side note, but connected to this, is listening to kind of a brainstorming session with some admin leadership people in local healthcare, talking about this idea of being willing to have that flexibility and maybe giving some of the options in terms of hybrid opportunities to the frontline workers, to the people who are impacted by it, and letting them have a voice in making those kinds of decisions and not keeping it. And again, there are some fears to work through and how that works out, but I thought it was an interesting concept that was coming from leadership.
Well, everyone, this has just been a really great conversation. I note the time. I'm going to have to let you all go here in just a minute. But before we wrap up, I just wanted to give Maureen and Kelly a chance to share a little bit more about where people can find the Women in Business Impact Lab, resources, how they can get in contact, et cetera, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
I guess I will let Maureen have the final word, and I'll tell you that you can find us. We have a presence on LinkedIn, so UBU-WBIL, as well as on Instagram. And for those of you who may be listening in our local community, we host monthly on-site learn and network events. So by connecting to our social media, you'll have an opportunity to stay up to date on all of those details as well.
So final word, I'm not sure there is a final word other than we're continuing to learn, to explore, to do research, to meet the needs of the community. We want to partner with the community on all of these issues and examine what's happening here locally. So we invite collaboration. We have a lot of events in the Women's Business Impact Lab where we can interact with people in our surroundings, and our goal is to serve and connect and make partnerships.
Absolutely.
Thank you again both for joining us today. Thank you, Angela, for being my co-host. This was a great conversation. We encourage everyone who's listening to reach out, get connected, come to our events, get connected with Kelly and Maureen and others in the lab and at the university. And as always, we hope everyone will stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And we hope you all have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.